And the light is red, which means go. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It is 3 p.m. Eastern Time on Sunday, which means we are live. Thank you for joining us. This is our own version of March Madness, which is, of course, much better than basketball because we're talking about poetry. I'm Sean Murphy. If you haven't checked out one of 1455's events before, thanks for being here. In brief, I am the executive director of 1455. We are a nonprofit organization obsessed with storytelling. We celebrate creativity and want to build community all the ways possible. So we have a variety of free events ranging from author events and interviews to workshops to podcasts to our annual summer festival. And you can find out more about all of these initiatives at 1455litarts.org. And I encourage you to reach out if you want to learn more or get involved. But the reason we're here today, I am very delighted. It's my pleasure to moderate this reading and discussion. I've been looking forward to it for months. And right off the bat, I want to acknowledge two people without whom today doesn't happen. The first is my good friend, Robert Bettman, who is the mastermind and executive director at Day 8 organization. And he has created, he's really the guy behind the scenes for the ANACOSTIA Swim Club, which is the partner that 1455 has worked with for these last three events, and with whom we will happily continue to work with because we love them, we love the work they do. I love Robert, and it's always a pleasure to support him. For those of you that either aren't from the area or didn't know, if you didn't know, it's currently both unsafe and illegal to swim in the Anacostia River, which is just an appalling state of affairs. So the Anacostia Swim Club is a social club that's designed is to serve DC residents and allow members to enjoy arts and cultural events like we're having today, along with service to the community along the Anacostia River corridor. And I think part and parcel to that is, of course, raising awareness, raising the hearts and minds, and raising funds to help restore this historic property. You can find out a ton more at anacostiaswimclub.com. I will put all the information in the comments section. And as a reminder, this event is being recorded, so I'll put this on the 1455 site with links to buy Laura's book, information about the Anacostia Swim Club and Day 8 and 1455. But secondly, and most importantly, I'd like to thank Laura McCarty for being here today, and not only for being here, but for writing her amazing collection, Just One Swallow. And full disclosure, I have some history with this book, having had the amazing opportunity and honor to select it as the winner of Day 8's DC Poet Project competition, of which more in a moment. But let me introduce our special guest, and we will look forward to some conversation, and we're going to hear the author read some of these poems, which I'm super excited about. But our superstar today, Laura, is a longtime resident of the Washington, D.C. region, and her creative work has appeared in the Rumpus, Lunch Ticket, Jelly Bucket, the St. Petersburg Review, among many other publications, including a family anthology of poetry, My Mother, My Daughter, My Sister, Myself. She was a finalist for the 2020 DC Poet Project and a finalist for the 2016 Diana Woods Memorial Award in nonfiction. She earned a Bachelor of Journalism from the University of Texas, Austin, and her MFA is from American University. The author of Just One Swallow, Laura, welcome. Thank you so much for finding the time to be here today. It's wonderful to connect with you again.
Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate it. And certainly wouldn't be here without you and without Robert. I want to thank 1455, the Anacostia Swim Club, and of course, Day 8 and Robert's backing of the poetry book. So I'm very excited to be here. So thank you very much.
Well, absolutely my pleasure. And I think, today's event really is kind of a microcosm of so much of what the three of us do. I think Robert and I connected because of our two organizations and found that our mutual networks had, several overlapping ties in the DC area and beyond. But doing things like trying to promote the arts, which I think until you see it happening, it always sounds like one of those things everyone wants to do. But it's not that difficult to do. It's really a simple matter of rolling up one's sleeves and finding great art and showcasing it and celebrating it. So the full circle for me from working with Robert and supporting what he does and feeling that love back and getting involved in the opportunity to read a bunch of manuscripts, which I'm delighted to say, all of which were very good, some of which were spectacular. But my opinion is my story. I'm sticking to it. Yours was the clear winner. So again, it really was an absolute joy. And these past couple of weeks revisiting this collection, which I have done in between selecting it and today, but doing another deep dive made me feel even better about my choice. So I'm ecstatic, and I think probably the best way to start, right, is for you to maybe introduce this collection. Like, what's its history? How did it come
Sure.
about? Was this kind of one burst of creativity, or was this a long work in progress, et cetera? But
Sure.
please take your time and tell us
Yeah.
about how Just One Swallow came together.
Okay. So I have written poetry since pretty much the day I was born. My mother is a poet. My grandmother was a poet. My great grandfather was a poet. It's been something that our family has really cultivated and cherished. So I grew up writing poetry and had always coveted that MFA. And I know the MFA gets a lot of, a lot of people think you don't need it. And I agree, you don't need it. But for me, at almost 50 years old, I really still wanted to go get it and learn. And I think at American University under David Keplinger and Kyle Dargan, I learned so much about poetry and was exposed to so many more poets I hadn't been reading,
Yeah.
which was, I think, a real gift that they gave me. And it was within that program over a 2.5 year period or so that I wrote these poems. And interestingly, most of the poems kind of look back 35, 40, 50 years. And so I would say that even though they were written within those 2.5 years, they were something that I was thinking about for my entire lifetime. So it's not as if I wasn't writing other poetry, but I really, in this book, visited um, an arc of my life, one arc of my life, from being a child to growing into a woman to a wife, a mother, and then a single mother. And so there was a real exploration for me in my program as to how that is portrayed in poetry. Uh, but but honestly, I didn't know what I was writing toward until the entire manuscript was finished and in front of me and the pages were on the floor. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And as you
Sure.
start to move them around. So that's how it sort of came about.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And one of that's fascinating to me because having read this now several times, it wouldn't have surprised me if you had said, I worked on this for 20 years. It absolutely doesn't surprise me that this was kind of a concentrated burst, albeit one that really looks backward over kind of the trajectory of your life, not just as kind of a woman, but as a mother, as a daughter, as a writer, as an observer, as someone that's seeing things that clearly stayed with you, that inspired some of this work. And I was talking to you a little bit before, we were kind of talking about how we wanted to approach this today. And, I certainly mean, I'm trying to find a way that this doesn't sound trite, but to me, this is really a powerful example of, any work, whether it's a novel or a collection of poetry, in my humble opinion, there's no right or wrong way to do it. But for me personally, something that has some scope and some ambition and is not just kind of a deep dive into a shallow pool or a shallow dive into a deep pool, but something that somehow has the generosity to encompass a lot of different things, I think is a considerable achievement. So in some ways, I would say, this is like part memoir, part novel, absolutely poetry, and works line by line as poetry, but it's something more than that. And I think that's something to acknowledge and celebrate.
Thank you for recognizing that, because as if for those of those people out there, sorry, who have read the book, it is there are times and the poems can be quite hard and very blunt, and it will show some of the experiences I've had. And I think for me, I've written poetry to make sense of things, and it is part memoir, it is part novel, it is trying to find my truth. And I think we tell ourselves stories to make sense out of things. And poetry helps to make sense out of sometimes events, and while also allowing for a mystery to stay inside the poem, and that mystery sort of being at the center. So that's what I tried to do, is kind of unravel the mystery that those mysteries in my life that have sort of sat with me.
Yeah, and yeah, that really resonates, and I think those of you that will be reading this book once you pick it up, which I cannot recommend more strongly, will see exactly what Laura's describing, and it's to me again that is, the poems speak for themselves on an individual and collective basis, but there's enough respect for the experience and for the interpretation that an individual will bring to them, that there is that air of mystery, and there at times horror, at times humor, beauty, but they're not just explicit, like these are slices of life. If you can render that beautifully, so great, but this is a lot deeper. Before, and what we also agree, which I think is a wonderful way to do this, is we'll talk a little bit, you can read a few poems, we'll talk a little more, but if you'll indulge me, and I don't think we're going to need to sell this collection, but I want to read the 2 paragraphs that I wrote to describe
Please.
why I chose this. And this is just me saying, folks, this is why I'm so enthusiastic to be here and why I felt this way about these poems. But I'll do this quickly, and then I'll step out of the way and let you read. But here's what I wrote in the book. Laura McCarty's Just One Swallow gracefully navigates the brutal and beautiful, sometimes in the same poem, occasionally in the same line, often on the verge of revelation, or else doubling back to track the wreckage. This collection provides a guided tour for past and present, a daughter, a mother, a traveler, a restless soul in search of feelings attainable only via honesty and experience. At times featuring a more analog America readers of a certain age will remember, and remote locales rendered at once exotic and unadorned, here are words you can taste, views you can smell, and portraits you can inhabit. Depicting the 70s, the South, the pleasure and pain of sexual awakening, bucolic landscapes and domestic battlegrounds, this work is a sustained shout in defiance of dark and silent spaces. Inadequate praise, but that was the best I could do. But I think what I'm trying to get at there is that this does contain multitudes, and does so beautifully.
Thank you, Sean. Your words are really beautiful.
Thank
And
you.
I hope my poems can stand up to them.
Well, listen, so now I think everyone would agree, enough from this guy. You can read as you see fit. You would ask me, are there some, I do have some as we go along that I might ask you to read, but I think you are the best person to decide where to begin and how to begin. So please do read it.
Okay, thank you, Sean. So yeah. I'm gonna start in the first section of the book, not with the first poem as I usually do, but it is bluebonnet season, and I am in Texas right now, where I grew up as a young child. And so I'm going to start with a poem called Switches. My sister Kathleen stood on the air conditioner, her white nightgown fluttering from the fan, a crown of bluebonnets in her hair. We cheered for her like she was Jesus. Liz and I, the thieves who hung by her side, picked the state flower, knowing it was a crime. Father let us choose our own switches from the backyard. Mom grew roses. We leaned over the hurricane fence and stole the neighbor's witch hazel branches. Thick was better than thin. Proud of our choices, we walked behind the garage, handed over the winning picks, and lifted our gowns. So for those who don't know, the bluebonnet is cherished in Texas, and while it's a myth, it's considered a crime to pick a bluebonnet. So this poem was sort of about understanding the dangers of going against authority and knowing the repercussions, but still standing ground. And I was young enough to do that because I hadn't been silenced completely yet. So
I love at the end the just the casual lifting of the skirt, as though this is not your first rodeo. It's
Right.
not the first time that this form of punishment's been meted out. Very, very subtle, that yet powerful.
Yeah, thank you. And this was not an unusual thing when you and I grew up. A lot of people had to pick their own switches, and so you got a little clever as to which ones you picked, knowing that if you picked one too small, your dad would go out and get a different one.
You know what? There's if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Richard Pryor. He talks about in one of his 70s. He's like, "You better not bring one too small. My dad was going to get the whole tree."
Exactly. Exactly. So, so the next one I'm going to read is called Houston Massacre. And this is a bit about now becoming silent. Houston Massacre. In the mornings, my sisters and I hunted for night frogs that climbed their way up the bayou to Mr. Patel's 7-Eleven parking lot, searching for dry land, crumbs from trash cans, or maybe new breeding grounds. Smashed by the mother running out for milk late at night, crushed by the teenager cruising for a smoke, or a truck driver needing a Coke. Mr. Patel paid us, the neighborhood cleaning crew, 25 cents a day to scrape up the dried, flattened frogs with tire tracks imprinted on their backs. Baked stiff from the heat, we flung them to the boys across the street. They collected frogs too, live ones they used for target practice with their BB guns. Pop, pop, pop. We weren't like them, but we watched.
Well, that to me, two of the key themes throughout this collection are recollection and evoking this past, but the act of bearing witness, which of course I think is literally inherent in the act of poetry. But certain poets are really bearing witness to what I would describe as something personal as opposed to natural, or I'm writing about that tree because it's going to make a good poem. These are poems about something that means something, and there's definitely the tension between how boys and girls, men and women, see the world, view the world. And you mentioned before you read that one, I wasn't sure when we should get into that. Maybe now's the right time.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked about this notion of being silenced and how
Mm-hmm.
through your poetry, I don't know, you found your voice or you found ways to find voices. But
Mm-hmm.
is this a good time to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, like you said, you can write a poem about a tree just because it's pretty, or you can use that tree as a metaphor, or and something to really grab a hold of the roots from. So, growing up, I had a pretty authoritarian parental experience until my mother went to work, and then it was sort of a free-for-all, and my parents got divorced, and I started to find that we on our own could be renegades and totally run the show. But as soon as they came home, we got very quiet, did what we needed to do, and there was no room for questioning, and so the questioning started coming out in my poetry. I never would dare to ask why, or maybe can we not do something uh, for fear of repercussions. So I began to explore it in my poetry.
Yeah, and I think when I talked about my little introduction, I was not trying to be folks watching be cute about this analog era. I think we're not just talking about, say, the 70s, but a different sensibility, right? And again, you mentioned people of our age, people that are that came of age before computers. That could be a whole topic of discussion in and of itself. But the fact of the matter is, whether there was things done right or wrong, or we've gotten better or worse, the fact of the matter is, this is the world we were brought into, and there was a more, I think, authoritarian, and yet is crazy. And again, I think you explore this tension, especially in those early poems, of it was a more authoritarian and small world in certain ways,
Mhm.
but we had more freedom ostensibly as kids. So I think there's
Right.
a beautiful tension that you explore, like being out in nature. I think is anathema to our digital culture now, and the understandable or maybe not so understandable overprotection of parents, who, of course, maybe are also responding to the freedom that they grew up with and overcorrecting. Uh,
Right.
and that gets into, again, talking about what you achieve, in this relatively short collection of poetry. You range from acute perceptions of being a daughter to very acute perceptions of being a mother, and how that, of course, has shaped your own sensibility, both as a person and a poet. But yeah, I mean, talk a little bit about what that was like to, like, what brought you back to Texas, and
Mhm.
aside from the fact that it's your childhood, but there obviously are you were obviously someone that was not unfamiliar with the natural world. That's clear
Right.
throughout these poems.
Right. Well, to my parents' credit, they were both very much nature lovers. Though my mom can't be described as a hiker or anything, she's a gardener and she loves being out in nature. And she would take us on picnics. Because back then that was a big deal to go on a picnic, and and have us imagine what it was like many, many centuries ago out in the forest. And then my stepfather took us to all the national parks growing up as well. So I was very connected to nature, and as you mentioned, as kids, we were kind of left to go out into nature as we pleased, and so there was that discovery there. There was the solace. There was the danger. Everything happened in the woods. And maybe that's a good time for me to read the poem called Those Woods.
Yes, please.
Okay. My little brother ran away on a duped up Schwinn to the dirt bike paths in the woods behind our school. I knew where to find him, but didn't go looking in those woods, where my sisters and I shoot the moon on our roller skates down rocky hills that scrape off our skin, leaving with raspberries we hide from our father. Those woods where we swing on the willow branches, our weight stripping every leaf as we do. Where my best friend Rochelle and I study her mom's joy of sex, trying out the positions with our clothes on and grating each other. Those woods where Mike B chased me after school, knocked me down to the ground, and kissed me because he thought I'd like it. I was 10. I found the neighbor molesting my friend in those woods. Everything I saw was my fault, not his, he said, because I forgot to whistle to announce my arrival. Those woods where my sister's friends let me try pot from an apple pipe we dug out with a pen, where Billy, Johnny, and I hit golf balls until one ricocheted back into Billy's head. That summer, when my father was beating up my brother, I let him run away because he could.
Wow. the, when I talk about the memoir novel aspect, there's so much going on there. I think for the reader, especially readers of a certain age, it invariably kind of evokes our own. That was how we rolled. Go in the woods and play. Go
Mhm.
outside and explore. Um, but I think, of course, as both literal and for metaphoric pop, you're talking about you go into places like that and discover things, some of which are not necessarily pleasurable.
Right. Right. And I think, as I was a young girl and developing into a young woman and being told very early on that something I didn't do was my fault, and and having to witness things that you weren't allowed to talk about, but that you knew were wrong. And so So the power in the last line is letting, taking some power of our own, and letting my brother, go out to the woods, and maybe he was going to be okay and maybe he wasn't, but at least he wasn't going to have repercussions at home.
Right, right.
So
And I think one of the many reasons that these poems resonated with me so deeply is, I think what we're also kind of talking about here is, um, kids. It's not just that you're not allowed to speak about certain things. You don't have the words,
mhm.
to speak, and that's where art, of course, can play such a valuable role in making sense. And you said this earlier. I think a lot of poets would say this. We write to a large degree to make sense of our world and the world and proceed from there. But the impetus behind so much of this writing is to puzzle through kind of memories that, for understandable reasons are lodged in our minds. And when you're, 40, 50 something and you're still thinking about things that happened when you were a certain age, there's a reason for
Yeah, yeah.
that.
Well,
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to lead into my next poem.
Yeah.
So my stepfather was a very or is a very gregarious man, and he came into our lives and kind of showed us a different world that we didn't know about. And however true or false it was, we didn't question it, so we believed him, and that's how this next poem came about. And the title of a poem is a line, essentially, and it's called "The First Time I Met My Stepfather. He showed me a Polaroid of himself standing next to a giant ostrich and swore the walking bird was his pet Oscar." I was 7 when this Greek New Orleans man with a Cajun drawl rolled up into the driveway in a turquoise Cadillac. He got out of the car, licking his powdered sugar fingers, and started passing out beignets from a brown paper bag. 1 week later, he bought a freezer for our kitchen, packed it with Twinkies and Suzy Q's, and told us never again to ask if we could have dessert. His name was Art, and my sisters and I called him that, which seemed like playing hooky and getting away with it. We left the formalities of yes, sir, and may I with our mother's first husband. The belt got put away, the switches stayed on the bushes. He took us out of Texas to a mansion in upstate New York. When we had to move again, he bought us a Newfoundland puppy on our drive to Chicago. With our car loaded with kids and suitcases, we squeezed Sweetheart in. Our first dog. She was our lollipop. We took road trips to Wall Drug in South Dakota. I learned how to fish at 5 o'clock in the morning, replaced Spam and hominy for bacon-wrapped shrimp and baked Alaska. He said the sun was shining when it was raining, and we could only believe him.
Wow. So, the poems are roughly structured. You certainly go from young girl to the present tense, but maybe talk a little bit about this exploration of, the obvious trajectory was your mother getting remarried, but you talk about, this different, whole different kind of experience that your family had. But the thing I was going to ask about, which I think ties in, is there are several poems where you were traveling, and of course that's you come back to that later during your travels as an adult. But I think it's a really powerful way to move the narrative along. It's literally happening. You're going places, but I like how you kind of leave Texas and are in the car and you're observing things. That was obviously a pretty pivotal time in your life, I would imagine.
It was. I think Texas signified something for me that changed once we moved. And we were all travelers. My parents were travelers. They were traveling saleswomen. So it always felt like our life was in movement. And so I think I return to that in my poetry a lot. I'm driving a lot. I'm moving. So it's a frequent theme. Yeah. And so I guess I can read the last poem in that first section called Out of Texas.
Okay, perfect.
And it starts with I drive away. Out of Texas. I drive away from the cedar, the grackles, and prickly pear, out of the desert, away from the locusts shedding on my windowsill. I leave the sticker bushes, fire ants, and cockroaches. Say goodbye to the sun that frizzles my skin. I crawl across Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia to the District of Columbia. 1,500 miles from home, I can hear my mother's garbled tongue. She's hemming my Easter dress when I am 3, straight pins in her mouth, la la lying to Mephistopheles. How does she not swallow the pointed metal? The colored heads bob up and down as she demands of me, Sensil.
So I'm curious, hearing you read and just talking about this, it's probably an impossible question to answer, but I'm gonna have fun asking it. So
Okay.
apologies in advance. Do you think if you hadn't left Texas, you would have become a poet?
I was a poet before I left
Okay.
Texas. Yeah. And because my family is so deeply rooted in poetry,
Uh-huh.
I certainly would have been a poet. I probably would have been a different kind of poet.
Right.
And and maybe the land wouldn't have meant so much to me in my poetry. I use so much of the landscape because it brings me back to a place, a time. And I think if I never left it, it just would have been a continuity and wouldn't perhaps play such a large role in my poetry.
Right. Right. Well, there's a bunch of reasons I asked, but it's kind of a self-indulgent aside, but just you're describing leaving Texas made me think of something I've written about, which is our experiences could hardly be more dissimilar in many ways.
Mhm.
I grew up in Northern Virginia and never moved states, but when I was 9, we moved across town. Which again, I knew then that was trivial, but to a 9-year-old,
Oh,
3 miles might as well be 300 miles. And we left the
yes.
neighborhood where all the kids I grew up with were, and we moved to a neighborhood that wasn't developed yet.
Mm.
So there were no kids for the first year. But I think this is an adult with a poetic sensibility taking liberties. But I think of that summer as the first time I really had to use my imagination because I was suddenly in the backyard or the
Interesting.
basement and I had to make up friends. So
Right.
I wouldn't go too far with this, but I trace that particular event. I don't know, perhaps the seed was already planted, but I think I would have been definitely a different person in terms of how I use my imagination and what developed out of that because of that departure.
Right. Right. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, I think these things shape us. The land around us shapes us, and then our imagination going back to that land.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So not the most artful segue, but depending on both your interest and comfort
mhm.
level, there are a couple of poems, and I remember. I mean, I can't say enough, right? And I won't say enough, but the whole collection floored me. But I remember when I first read these, you have a couple of poems about young womanhood and
Mhm.
some trespasses that occur,
Yes.
and I mean, it rocked me. The not just the topic, the subject matter, but the way that you are able to convey these difficult situations. I don't know if you have any interest in reading any of them, but
Yeah.
I
Sure.
wrote
Of
down
course.
like two in particular that I
Mhm.
wrote down because rereading those rocked me again. But no
Mhm.
consent and
Mhm.
accounting, which I think I wouldn't say works better on the page, but it's such an
Right.
artful construction. I think I'd love to hear you read it, but on the page, maybe that's a good teaser for people that, by the way, you got to pick up a copy of this. The way she renders it on the page is just brilliant. But those two poems, I think, are in particular are just devastating.
Yeah. I'm happy to read them. In fact, um, I didn't first come out publicly about I was raped as a teenager. I didn't come out publicly about it until I wrote an essay for Lunch Ticket, and it was the first time. And then after that, I sort of explored how to write about the particular incident. And so I wrote this poem called No Consent during the whole consent ish, era of, when it suddenly it came to the forefront of the news.
Right.
And I decided to write it in one sentence so that it has kind of a rushed feeling that when you're in the moment, you don't know exactly what to do, and it's moving very, very fast.
Yes.
So I'll read that one first.
Okay.
No consent. When he asked me to dinner, I didn't know I could say anything but yes. When he said his friend would tag along, I thought he was showing me off. He walked me to a motel room, shattered its window, told his friend to keep watch, grabbed me by the wrist and pulled me in, scraping my belly against glass. I didn't scream because I was afraid I would get in trouble for trespassing and worried he thought I was fat because he couldn't get my jeans all the way off. I wanted him to like me, so he would stop.
For a man can never write that poem, and I'm not a fan of stay in your lane. I think with creativity, if you're able to pull it off, but that's one probably superficial but very genuine. Just like a man couldn't write that poem, but nobody but you could write that poem because this is your experience. But the line about the jeans not coming off because it got you, to me, evokes how women are trained to think, how younger, vulnerable women think. So, you're not just, well, I don't want to tell you what you did, but in my opinion, in my perception, you're not just indicting a horrible situation and what was done to you, but kind of our cultural,
right,
the underpinning sensibility that enables, that even makes it possible for something like this to happen, and that the victim would afterwards feel is probably best I don't talk about this. It's just
right.
astonishing.
Right. You nailed it. It was a testament to society, and I really believed those things,
Right.
and I believed him for 30 years.
Sure.
So I think what a lot of people don't understand is, why would a woman stay silent? It doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't she come out? And there are a gazillion reasons. One, because she thinks she's too fat. Or one, she'll get in trouble because she was in a place she wasn't supposed to be. I mean, there are a lot of things that not just women, but people take on that they are not meant to take on. And so, and I think, and this is not to point any fingers at my parents, but really to that generation, you were told to be quiet. You didn't ask questions. And so you didn't have that voice that you needed in times of terror. And that carried with me for most of my life. It's only been in the last probably 5 years that I've really started to speak out. And in this next poem that you spoke of, Accounting, it shows you in the years that it's very recent. And it becomes difficult, all the situations a woman can be found in. And it is a difficult poem to read because there are a lot of ways you can read it. And for those readers who don't know, you can read it vertically, you can read it horizontally, you can read it kind of diagonally. So I'm just going to read it how I read it today, and let's see if it works.
Maybe hold it up first. No one will be able to see it, just so they can see what we're talking about. Okay, perfect.
So kind of like a spreadsheet.
Yep.
And it's called Accounting. Who? My home exterminator. Where? My basement. When? 2011. What he does, traps me against my washing machine. What he says, I made you a mixtape. Who? My work colleague, in the back of a 4x4 on a highway in the Dominican Republic in 2010. He leans across me, pressing my arm into my chest to open the office window. What he says, I want to dance with your breasts. Who? My dermatologist, in his office in Arlington, Virginia, 2009. He drops packets of Retin-A at my feet, bends down and looks up my dress. My 8-year-old daughter sits next to me. We are there for her skin rash, not my face. What he says, I can get you lots of those eye packets for free if we're good friends. My employer, in a parking lot in 2008, he grabs my arms, I turn my face, his 80-year-old wet lips miss mine. My cheeks are soaking as if a dog has licked them. See you tomorrow. Who? A first date. Fort Lauderdale, Florida, 1986. He breaks into a hotel room, rapes me. What he says, you'll be a good mother someday.
Well,
So not all my poems are true, but this one is.
mhm.
I mean, all of them have some truth, but this is just, it is what it says. It's accounting. It's just piece by piece.
Well, so again, I think artistically, it's a home run because the cleverness of both the title, what it's doing, the way it's presented, and almost, well, the matter of fact to me makes it that much more devastating. And you already talked about this, and it's so part of our, I think, in a very good way, very part of our contemporary discourse, the normalcy of this and kind of this, whatever the opposite of treasure trove, the volume, once we all start speaking about this, that this is kind of almost every woman's experience. And I was going to say when you were talking earlier, although we can and should keep the focus on women because that's really kind of where it belongs in terms of like what the work we need to do. But I think about like altar boys and even men, like this whole notion of silence is both generational, but also I think anyone that's survived sexual trauma, you ask the rhetorical question, why stay silent? I think that has been on all of us as a society for decades or centuries. Like, you just don't talk about it. And that's
Right.
without getting into the shame, which is the double tragedy, because the
Right.
victimized person usually is the one that carries the trauma.
Right.
But I think this notion of you stay silent, I think only a very contemporary audience would even really ask that question without a tremendous amount of empathy, because it's just not how we did it back then.
No. And it's really been very recent that you talk about it.
Right.
So and it's interesting that I have two young daughters, not young, they're young women
Yeah.
in college, and they have taught me so much that sometimes they catch me that I don't realize even my language, how it reinforces this narrative that women should be silent or the victims should be silent. And it's how I was raised as well. And they've taught me to sort of turn things around. And even in the past 5 years, I'm able to say, well, wait a second, we can't speak about X this way because it blames the victim. And so I have my daughters to thank for that. um,
Well, and to me, in addition to talking about, the notion of why this is all important, right? I mean, anything we can do to demystify and really almost, to make, not that any of what you're writing is banal. It's the power of the matter of fact way it's described, but the cumulative weight of these stories is kind of a slap in the face for anyone that would claim ignorance. But more, the power of poetry is to be able to do this without preaching, and I emphasize this, but
right.
preaching or making it polemic or immediately turning someone off. The power of poetry, of course, is the subtle way you can make points that are arguably many times more powerful than the best written op-ed.
Yeah, poetry I think is incredibly powerful, and I love that it's coming. I mean, we've been talking about it for a long time. It's coming back to the forefront, but really, the podcasts that are out there that people are listening to as they walk, that I'm listening to as I walk, particularly during COVID, when you can't go to these events to hear the spoken word, and these Zoom calls and Facebook Live events. It's been such a treat to have something to turn to in this pandemic. It's solace, and poetry has been there for eons as a solution, which is very powerful. I wanted to read one poem. It's later in the book, but it's about one of my daughters, and it was about a time she and I had an argument, and she is so much more powerful than I ever was, and she sort of takes things into her own hands. It's called 11-Year-Old. Her turquoise robe flying behind her like a cape, she runs, Cars move past her on their way home from work. She swings her arms back and forth like her father taught her so she can run faster, hoping the cape will lift her into the sky away from me. So it's short, simple, but she's taking things into her own hands, which I really wasn't able to do at the same age.
And you know, it's like, I don't, again, I think the power, the enduring power and import of this collection is that you really are able to convey your own experience as a young girl, and the ways in which you and so many of us are powerless, and really talk about, you know, in the classic show don't tell fashion, how, whether it's intentional or not, I happen to think it is, but your own motherhood is guiding the next generations to be more vocal and to be more powerful. So there's this tremendous sense of hope that infuses the trajectory of the collection, because you have borne witness, you have experienced it, but you are obviously whole and strong, or stronger, and even that is conveyed. So even when revisiting some of these extremely heavy and dispiriting poems, the topic wise, there's almost a hope even in those, because it's like it's the person that's borne witness recounting that and having the strength and the courage to recount it.
Yeah, thank you.
So there's never any despair in these poems, which despair is fine, right? We wallow in despair as creatives, but in this particular collection, there's always kind of this light beneath, everything that's being written about.
Thank you. So I don't know how you feel about me reading I Left My Girlfriend for My Wife.
Great about it.
So, but it has some vulgarity in it. And this is okay. It's for Charles Bukowski, and it's obviously a parody because it's written from the male's point of view.
Yeah.
In some ways. So let's just see how it goes.
Okay.
I left my girlfriend for my wife. I want to fuck you, Mary said. Hand me my whiskey, I said. No, I want to fuck you. So we did. Hand me a cigarette, I said. I want to fuck again, Mary said. I've been shacking up with you for 7 years, Mary. I like to smoke and drink, I said. And I left. I walked to Linda's apartment. It was small. She was on the couch with her stomach pouching the way a good drunk's belly rises below the chest. I would drink from you all day if you let me, I said. She did. We took 2 cold beers from the refrigerator and sat back on the couch drinking from one another's bottles. Let's fuck, Hank, she said. We did. We smoked, drank, and fucked all night. Yeah, we did. And when I first thought about including this, one of my mentors thought, well, why this poem in this book? And I wanted this poem in this book because I felt like the women had power in some ways, even though the man was leaving his girlfriend back to his wife. The wife had the ultimate power at the end and called the shots. And for me, that was kind of the arc, the woman starts to rise up despite the circumstances.
Yeah.
So.
No, I mean, absolutely. And, I would even take issue with you're describing this vulgarity. I think it's just real. It's real language between real people. And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I would be, I think, remiss, and I purposely haven't brought this up because I didn't want to linger too long on, but I would love to hear you talk a little bit about, because I think this is relevant both to really any writer, but also readers. So I think it's a common question. And this is, anytime you write about family, even if it's as a point of departure, I'd say at best, it's a tricky situation, because anyone that's not a sociopath is going to be sensitive to a range of potential misinterpretation, et cetera. But maybe talk a little bit about, you don't have to even really talk specifically about the poem so much as the idea of writing about, because again, I mean this is a tremendous compliment in the sense that I think there are some writers that they just write beautiful words and that validates their work, but you don't really know anything about them.
Mhm,
I never have presumed that I know a lot about you through these poems,
mhm,
but I think clearly this conversation, some of the things I thought are true. So I
mhm.
think it's fair to say this is a type of book where a reader will get to know Laura McCarty better having read it. So with that said, maybe just talk about the art
Sure,
of writing about one's life,
sure,
and putting it on the
sure.
page.
I think, I mean, I think every writer is different,
Yeah,
but for me, I have to be able to have a little bit of fiction and a little bit of truth to be able to keep the truth as my own. So it's important, although I say, accounting is all true. I think that might be the only poem in the book that is completely true.
right.
Um, because I am trying to protect those that I love, and a former professor of mine, Richard McCann, who has passed recently, whom I just adored, used to say, "Don't write out of anger or grief, write out of love." And so I'm really trying to understand things in the poems, and I want the book to be looked at as in its entirety rather than just one single poem to make some kind of assumption
Yeah,
about a relationship. And then some of the poems are completely different than they appear to be. I have a poem called Buried in Texas, which is about a woman who goes to a man's grave, and it's her longing this love that she had growing up. And the truth is that poem came out of my love for my father, and him not acknowledging us during in his obituary, and wondering what that's like, not to be acknowledged. And so I think that people can learn something about me for sure, but I think it's also the artist's job to be sure that they're not causing harm. And so my family knows what's true and not true,
yeah,
and um, so I try to write it so that it can speak to people without causing any harm. And then my mother is a poet, so she completely understands the artist's creativity. Sometimes I would run poems about by her and say, well, it didn't end exactly like this, and she said, well, it doesn't matter, you're the poet. And so that graciousness of my mother to allow me to write, um, thinking about the sound, the form, the impact that the poem may make without necessarily sticking straight to the truth, is a real gift that she gave me. So I'm lucky for that. But I do know it's a huge struggle, even being given that permission, as to what line do you do you cross?
Well, and so my question actually is twofold as well, Laura. Like, so yes, there's the navigation of inter family relations,
Mhm.
but also I'm kind of talking about the poet or the novelist has to go into it with the resigned acceptance that people are going to think this is me. I think
Yes.
with poetry or novels, if you use the first person, people meaning intentionally or not are going to assume that this is you. And I think any of us that have written anything have had people come up to us and go, I've known you your whole life. I never knew XYZ happened. And you're like, it didn't, and
Right.
oh, well then it didn't happen. That's fake. And it gets into this whole like, but I think the artist needs to feel comfort with what Tim O'Brien describes as, true story truth being truer in artistic ways than true truth, because
Right.
you can't inoculate yourself from bad writing by saying, but this is how it happens. Like, so then put it in
Right.
your journal for it to resonate with an audience. And I think this is, again, I'm happy to continue to compliment you. I think this is what you do consistently, like the image of, throwing frogs to boys. Like, yeah, that's an image. And whether that happened or not, that's evoking pages and pages of the difference between how boys and girls react and yada, yada, yada. But so I'm talking about the bravery, frankly, that you had to say, let people read these however they may, but understanding that some people are going to say, wow, I know everything I need to know about Laura, which is clearly not true.
Right, right. So thank you. And it was scary at first, but then, my mom just really said, let them believe what they want to believe. They don't know. you know, which was great. She really gave me that strength. So
I think that becomes a chicken egg thing too, right? I think whether it's a poet or a novelist, I think that's also a life lesson. I think most of us get to a certain age, a certain point where we realize, despite my best intentions, certain people are going to think certain things
mhm,
with bad or good intent. So if I can't control like what my innermost circle thinks, I'm certainly not going to handicap myself as a writer. But I think there's
right.
an element of bravery there. And,
Yeah.
I want to celebrate the fact that you had the bravery because the world's a better place for these poems. But, I'm sure that some of these were not the easiest poems to write.
They weren't. They weren't. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Um, so we've talked about the kind of the, you know, autobiographical aspects,
Mhm,
the mother daughter.
mhm,
I'm curious, looking ahead, like is
mhm.
do you have more work coming that's along these lines? What projects are you working on, and how similar or dissimilar to Just One Swallow is your next batch?
So they're quite different, honestly. It's an interesting thing to get a lot of praise for a certain kind of writing you've done, and then suddenly you find yourself you're writing very differently.
Yeah.
Um, so my poems now are a little bit more environmental and questioning more universal topics rather than just personal topics. And maybe I could just read you a new poem, and then
I
it'll
would
kind of
love that.
give you an
Yay.
insight to it, and we can kind of just end on that new poem.
Perfect.
Okay. It's called The Buck in the Narrows. And this is written from an experience my daughter Chloe and I had hiking out at Zion National Park. The Buck in the Narrows. In muted brown coat and velvet horns, with a rack not fully grown, you are the river you run, the stones you trample over, the salt of your cathedral. I want to wild like you, in the bottom of the gorge, between 1,000-foot sandstone canyon walls varnished red, where young pinyon pines burst and Fremont cottonwoods snow the sky. Is that sweat on your back, or the Virgin River's liquid silver? You gallop so swiftly, I can't be sure you touch the ground until you stop and stare at me. Are you running from or toward? Either way, I would join you. But companion is not what you are looking for. A soldier in the park, you turn, the hollow clapping of your hooves, echoing like the voice of water.
Wow. Wow. Well, you know,
So different.
different, but again, I want to be very careful here and not unintentionally be patronizing when I'm trying to be very complimentary. But I think what I really respond to, and I imagine many others do and will to your writing, is there's just a profoundly feminine perspective. But I mean that in the best, daughter, woman, independent, artist, the motherly figure, but this wisdom of, peace and perspective. And it's a voice ranging through all these topics we've discussed today that the world needs. I think one of the reasons we have Me Too and one of the reasons we have the podcasts is because we have been lacking strong, perceptive, unabashed female voices. So I don't want to minimize the power of these poems as describing them as feminist, but I think there's a powerful female voice and it's very empowering. And
Thank
I think women will be inspired and refreshed, but I think men will be enlightened. So
Thank you so much, Sean. And I see that we're at 4 o'clock. So I just want to thank you and 1455 as a whole, and Anacostia Swim Club and Day 8 and Robert once again. It's been such a treat.
Well, it's a pleasure spending time with you. I know that this will not be the last time we talk about your work and poetry in general. And going forward, you will always be a welcome guest to discuss these topics. We look forward to showcasing some of your future work. But again, I mean, the best compliment I can give you is that you wrote this book, It moved me tremendously. And again, folks, those of you watching, I will put links in, support your independent bookstores. You can go right to day8.org and order this from their site. Just One Swallow, Laura McCarty, absolute joy to have you here.
Such a pleasure.
So be well, stay safe,
Thank
keep
you.
writing. We'll be in touch. And again, folks, I'll put this information in the comments, but check out ANACOSTIASwimClub.com. In fact, I want to make 100% sure I say it. Yes, ANACOSTIASwimClub.com. Check them out, see the work they're doing, support them, spread the word, buy a copy of this book, spread the word, support your local artists. It's been a tough year, but we're starting to emerge from it. And I think celebrating poetry like this is the best way to remind us that none of us are alone and that we're all hoping to make the world a better place. So, Laura, on that note, I thank you again. And I really do look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks so much, Sean. Take care. Stay safe.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.